A Cornish Maid. Side 7. Mrs. Veal was made of the same stern stuff as her gran, as strong as Cornish granite, coping with everything that came her way. It wasn't right to think of old folks as being past their day. It was young ones, like herself, who had to learn to cope, she thought, still shaking as she filled the kettle from the tap, and flinched as the sting of ice-cold water splashed over her hands. But not all young ones were weak. Some were like Dolly, living among the bombs in London, and Luke, wherever he was now, had more guts than a lot of others too. There and then she vowed to try to be more like them. Mr. Veal was only in hospital for a couple of days. The beds were needed for more important cases than one old man who'd brought this on himself, a nurse told him cheerfully, while pressing his hand, as she did so to show there were no hard feelings. Amber asked to go and see him with Mrs. Veal that evening, just to satisfy herself that he really was going to be all right. He looked older and more frail in the hospital bed, but was perky enough to give his wife back as good as she gave him. "Silly old fool! All this upset for the sake of a bit of cheese," she scolded. "And you do the same for a bit of chocolate, old girl, so don't harp on." Despite the good-hearted bickering, it wasn't hard to see the affection between them, even though they never expressed it in a sloppy way, and Amber found herself wondering if her own mum and dad would have been like this, if things had been different. It brought a lump to her throat, because she would never know. She busied herself in looking around the ward instead, and immediately wished she hadn't, because apart from one or two older ones, like Mr. Veal, there were so many young men, heavily bandaged or hooked up to machines, who were clearly casualties of the war. Somehow it seemed to bring it all together. The young fighting men who were wounded in battle, lying amongst those who had almost lived their lives and were subjected to the normal process of just getting old. "I thought about being a nurse once," she said without thinking, "but it didn't last long. I don't think I could deal with the blood and stuff and all the things they have to do." She shuddered, unable to get the thought of Uncle Joe out of her head at that moment, and the horrific imagery of him finding an arm among the rubble of what had once been someone's house. "You could do anything you set your heart on, Amber," Mr. Veal said, "although we'd much rather you stayed and worked for us, if that's not being selfish." "It's not," she said quickly, "but it does make me feel a bit useless, seeing these nurses rushing about and saving lives." One of the nurses attending the patient at the next bed straightened up and paused at Mr. Veal's bedside. "If you really want to help, you can always come in on Sundays," she said. "We always need help in winding bandages and making teas for the patients and all the extra things that take our time. Go and see Matron if you're interested." It had been said on a whim, no more, but Amber almost felt that she had no option now if she didn't want to appear as a scaredy-cat kid. It wasn't what she had planned, but by the time she and Mrs. Veal left the hospital, with the assurance that Mr. Veal could go home tomorrow, and a warning to keep off the cheese, even if they could get any, it was all settled. "Well, I must say, this has been quite a day," Granny Penn said at last, when Amber finally reached home that evening. "I thought you had gone to that drama group again after work. I certainly didn't expect this news about Mr. Veal, but I'm glad to hear he's going to be all right. I'm a bit surprised that you're going to work at the hospital on Sundays, though." "Do you mind, Gran?" Amber asked anxiously. "I'd forgotten all about going to church in the mornings when I said I'd do it." "I dare say the good Lord will think this is just as important as you turning up at his house once a week. I'm proud of you, my dear." "Are you?" she said, flushing. "I don't know why. I nearly fell to pieces when I heard Mr. Veal had had a heart attack, even if it didn't turn out to be one. So I don't know yet how I'll cope if I have to see anything bad in the wards. And don't think I'm thinking seriously about being a nurse, because I'm definitely not." She knew she was babbling a bit, but the reality of it was only just dawning on her, and she couldn't back out now. She had too much pride for that. She meant what she said, though. She was definitely not going to be a proper nurse. But if Dolly could face all those terrible sights on the London streets every day, then she could do a Sunday job, and she would do it. It was funny how the thought of Dolly kept cropping up, as if she was using her as a yardstick. Little Dolly Daydream, who wasn't as drippy as Amber had at first thought. "You're my granddaughter," Granny Penn went on, "and no granddaughter of mine is going to flinch from a bit of blood. What you must do is always to think of the person inside the bandages, my dear, and remember that he won't particularly want to see his blood outside his body either, instead of inside it, where it belongs." Amber started to laugh. "You always put things so well, Gran." And if she could cheer up even one of those poor wounded men on the ward on Sunday, she supposed she could be a sort of Florence Nightingale. Matron had said some of the wounded soldiers whose hands were burned wanted somebody to write letters home for them, and she had volunteered for that at once. It was something special to tell Dolly in her letter that night. "Poor old Veely has to keep off the cheese in future," she wrote, "but it gave us all a scare. Anyway, I'm going to work at the hospital on Sundays now, rolling bandages and making teas and writing letters for the wounded soldiers. I won't have to do anything medical, thank goodness. Even seeing some of the blokes with blood seeping out of their bandages gave me the willies. Gran's quite pleased with me, though, and you've got to do what you can, haven't you?" She read it back, groaning as she realised how damn pompous she sounded, when really she was starting to get nervous about what she had promised to do. It was all very well to be determined to be brave and patriotic, but why couldn't she have thought of something else, like working in a factory making munitions or something, or joining the Women's Land Army? She'd never even thought about that, and she was too young anyway. But she was fond of animals, and she could always work on a farm. She had to admit it wasn't something that really appealed to her, even though there were farms not far from the outskirts of Falmouth, in easy distance of cycling home every night. It was just an idea to tuck away in her mind if the Sunday hospital work became too much. She knew she should feel guilty, because the real nurses had far worse jobs to do than making tea and rolling bandages, including the horror of changing the dressings on some of the festering wounds that she had been unfortunate enough to see. Not everybody could deal with pain and suffering, but there had to be other ways of being useful, especially when you were only 15. Because she and Dolly were supposed to be sharing their thoughts and secrets, she decided to tell her all about the idea of maybe working on a farm. It wasn't a secret anyway. It was just a passing thought. If she decided to work on a farm or anywhere else where she could be doing useful war work, she'd have to give up the craft shop. That would be a blow, but the Veals could manage very well without her. She finished her letter to Dolly with a flourish. "So, that's what's been happening down here in the sticks. By the way, how's life on the market stall? Met any passing Yanks who are going to make you a Hollywood star yet? Your friend, Amber." It was a bit sarky, and she knew it, but that was the way she and Dolly had always been. And after relating all her own ideas about the hospital, and then the farm possibility, well, working on a market stall and selling dreary bomb-damaged goods that were obviously a bit dodgy, was the tamest thing she could imagine. She wrote a similar letter to Luke. His ship was called HMS Tigress, but with only the vaguest address to send letters to, she had to restrain herself from writing too often. Her feelings for him hadn't diminished in the slightest, though, and she knew they never would. She began work at the hospital on the very next Sunday, remembering to tie her hair up neatly. She was so nervous she could have wet herself, but the first job she was given was rolling bandages well out of sight of the wards, and it was such a boring and repetitive task that she gradually relaxed. Teas were the next thing on the agenda, and all she had to do was to hand them to the patients alongside the nurse with the trolley. The only time she faltered was when she tried to offer a cup of tea to a man with heavily bandaged hands, and realised she had to offer it to him for him to sip. She was so terrified terrified it was going to be too hot that she slopped it down his hospital gown and caused the older nurse to tut-tut loudly.
"Leave the girl alone, nursey," the man said. "A bit of a spill never hurt anybody, and it's a treat to see a pretty young lass on the ward for a change."
"You're not from around here, are you?" Amber said, noting the way he had called her lass. A Cornish man would have called her a pretty young maid.
"Yorkshire, born and bred, and missing the wife and bairns. I'd show you a photo of 'em if I didn't have these blasted stumps to deal with."
He held up the heavy bandages, and Amber realised with horror that there were probably no hands there at all, only what was left of them. "Come along, Amber," the nurse said briskly, seeing her face. "There are more patients on the ward waiting for their tea."
"Come back and see me again,"
the man called after her. There were more patients in a similar state to that one, and more embarrassments, but thankfully the teas were eventually finished. Amber was left with collecting the cups and clearing everything away, and her hands still shook as she did so.
"You can write a letter home for me if you like, lass," the man she had spoken to before told her. "They said there might be somebody who could do it."
"I'll ask," she said with a gasp, thinking this was going to be her salvation. Otherwise, she knew she couldn't do this after all. The nurses were mostly cheerful, even if they seemed hard and unfeeling to Amber, but she realised they had to keep their emotions in check because of the things they were expected to do. But she wasn't hard. She wasn't used to any of this, and she was almost in tears as some of the patients with scarred and disfigured faces and bodies, some without limbs, tried to mouth their requests and to drink the tea that was clearly scalding their throats, however weak it was. And it was truly what Granny Penn would have called ditch water, Amber thought with a catch in her throat. There wouldn't be many tea leaves left for her to juggle with in these empty cups. She was sure that some of the patients would prefer not to have their fortunes told anyway, and the future for one or two of them looked horribly bleak. But at least Amber could write letters. After that first eye-opening morning, she went to Matron and asked if she could have paper and envelopes to do it for anyone who requested it. She stared at Matron unblinkingly, only the slight trembling in her hands giving her feelings away. But Matron's eyes were keen enough to notice the signs. "That's a good idea, and you know, my dear, not everyone is suited to hospital work," she said. "I want you to think of today as a trial period, that's all. And if you find it's not to your choosing, then you are perfectly free to say so." "I don't want to let you down," Amber mumbled. "It's just that sometimes the smells and the groaning in the wards makes me feel as if I'm suffocating. I know I'm being a coward, but I can't help it." "You're not being a coward at all. It's braver of you to say exactly how you feel. But please do as I suggest, Amber, and try it just for today. Nobody will think badly of you if you decided not to carry on. In the meantime, I'll organise the paper and envelopes for the patients' letters. They'll really appreciate that." "She was very kind," Amber told Granny Penn that night when she went home, more exhausted than she had expected. "She looks a bit of an old harridan, but she's not really. It was better when I spent the afternoon writing letters for some of the patients, although even that was difficult when one or two wanted me to put in quite personal things. I don't know which of us was more embarrassed, them or me. But I tried to imagine I was writing lines in a play, and then it was a bit easier." "So, are you going back next week?" Amber avoided her eyes. "I'm not sure. Probably. Today was a trial period. I need to decide if I feel really suited to it, and if they still want me." "Just remember, there's no disgrace in changing your mind. You're very young to be working in a hospital and seeing the kinds of things no young girl should have to see." Amber was filled with sudden passion. "Some of those patients aren't much older than me, Gran."
And they didn't ask to see those things either. Nor to have their arms or legs blown off, or to lose their sight, did they? I don't want to feel like a failure. So I'll have to see how I feel about it next Sunday.
During the following week, the decision was made for her. Amber and Mrs. Veal were chatting amiably in the shop when there was an almighty crash from the back room. They rushed through the bead curtain to find that Mr. Veal had collapsed on the floor. A large pool of blood was seeping out from an angry gash on his head where he must have caught it on the edge of the table when he fell. The blood was already matting his white hair, his face a greyish, parchment-like hue to match it. The doctor eventually said that it wasn't the blow to his head that killed him. This time it was a genuine and massive heart attack, and he could never have reached the hospital in time for them to do anything. In fact, he was almost certainly dead before he reached the floor. The shock of finding the man in such a state almost paralysed Amber, but not nearly as much as the wailing and keening from Mrs. Veal. She was covered in her husband's blood by the time she went to the hospital with him in the ambulance, even though it was obvious they could do nothing for him except to confirm that death had occurred. Amber was left to clean up the back room, scrubbing the floor as best she could, while the hot, sweet stench of fresh blood made her stomach heave almost uncontrollably. Such an intimate act for the two people who had been so kind to her made up her mind about her future instantly, although her head was in such a crazy muddle she couldn't formulate the thought properly. She didn't know how long she had been on her knees, near to sobbing as she did the gruesome task, and she had no idea that someone had sent for her Gran until she heard the shop bell tinkle. She yelled out angrily that they were closed, having forgotten to shoot the bolt when the others had left. The next moment, Granny Pen had pushed the bead curtain aside and gathered Amber up in her arms.
"My poor little maid," Granny Pen said roughly. "You shouldn't have to do this. There's surely one of the men hereabouts who would have come and done it."
"It's my job, Gran," she said shrilly. "It's where I work, and I couldn't let Mrs. Veal come back and see it, could I?"
She looked down to where the soap and hot water had made an impression on the bloodstains now. But in her mind's eye, she knew she would always see them there, probably even more than Mrs. Veal would. This was the least she could do for her. It was the only thing, except to be here when she returned home. Her eyes moved to her hands, red raw now, both with scrubbing and blood, and she felt the hysteria rising as she babbled.
"Oh, Gran, it was the worst thing. Not so much for poor Mr. Veal, because he wasn't feeling anything anymore, and the doctor said he wouldn't have known what was happening. It was so much worse for her, for poor Mrs. Veal, and I couldn't do anything to comfort her. But it made me realise I couldn't face seeing any of the soldiers' wives and families come into the hospital and having to be told that their men had died. I couldn't bear seeing them and hearing them and feeling as helpless and useless as I did today."
Granny Pen held her tight until the shaking began to ease a little. "You've had a bad shock, my dear, and now you're going to sit down while I make us both a strong cup of tea, and then we'll clear all this up together so that it's all nice and tidy for when Mrs. Veal gets back. My old bones aren't so creaky that I can't get down and do a bit of scrubbing, although you've already done the worst of it. Go and wash your hands now, and splash your face with cold water, and then you'll feel a lot better." Amber doubted that she'd ever feel better again. She might get the stains off her hands, but the smell was still in her nostrils, and the memories were in her head, and she was still trembling when Granny Pen thrust a hot cup of tea in her hands.
"I can't go back to the hospital any more, Gran," she whimpered. "I can't."
"Then you won't go. There's no need."
"But won't you think badly of me?"
Granny Pen spoke solemnly. "I couldn't think more highly of you than for what you've been doing here today, my love.
I think you'd be doing a Christian duty in calling in on Mrs. Veal on a Sunday afternoon for a few weeks and doing a good turn for a neighbour. She'll be needing to see a cheerful face that she knows, just as much as those poor casualties at the hospital who've got plenty of nurses to take care of them. Things always seem so much worse to deal with at your age, love. But you'll get over it, I promise. And so will Mrs. Veal, given time.
Somehow, she managed to take away all the shame of it, thought Amber. Even though Amber had only spent one day at the hospital, there was no hint of censure from her gran that she wasn't going back there. She'd only been on trial after all, but Granny Penn was the saint, not her. She'd tried, but she'd failed, and in her own mind she would always know it, no matter what anybody said. There were practical things to be done before some kind person brought Mrs. Veal back home. The back room floor had eventually begun to dry and to look less of a slaughterhouse, and Amber had put a sign in the craft shop window to say that owing to a bereavement it would be closed until further notice. The news would probably have spread already, and she wouldn't have detailed it more personally without Mrs. Veal's permission. Granny Penn took the ashen-faced widow upstairs for a lie-down, while Amber remained in the shop itself, pretending to be busy, dusting things that didn't need dusting, and wishing all the time that she wasn't aware of the murmur of voices from upstairs and the frequent sound of weeping. Nothing was as bad as this, she thought fiercely. She had felt desperately sorry for those poor patients in the hospital, but they were strangers. They hadn't been close to her the way this was close. This was personal. It was almost like losing one of her own family, and she hardly knew how to stop crying herself. Granny Penn came downstairs a while later and told Amber that Mrs. Veal was sleeping with the help of one of her sedatives. She had a piece of paper in her hand. Apparently, there's a daughter living about 5 miles from here on the Redruth Road, Granny Penn said. She doesn't know what's happened yet, of course, and it's bound to be a shock. From what I can gather, she and her father hadn't spoken for years, but Mrs. Veal thinks she may come and stay for a week or two until the funeral's over. I've got the address, so we must find someone to go there and break the news.
I'll go,
Amber said at once.
I can easily cycle there.
Anything was better than staying here and not knowing what to do. Not that she knew how to tell a stranger that she had just lost her father. Oh, God.
You're a good girl, Amber. Well then, I'll stay here and see what I can find in the cupboard to make a stew or something for later. They won't feel like eating, but they'll need to keep up their strength.
Any hope that her gran might say it was too far for her to cycle, or that it would be better to send someone older, was dashed at once. Besides, she had cycled far longer distances than this many times, and she just hoped she would find the right words to say once she reached the daughter's house. She'd never heard Mrs. Veal mention a daughter, though it probably explained the photo on the mantelpiece in the back room. It was almost a surprise to be out in the fresh air and to find that the day was still bright, the birds still singing, the docks full of ships and sailors, and the town still going about its usual business. It was as if Amber had expected everything to have stopped, held in some kind of suspension, just because one middle-aged man had died. She bent low over the handlebars, not wanting anyone to stop her and greet her, expecting her to make small talk as if nothing had happened to shake the daylights out of her on this lovely summer's day. She found the house she sought without any trouble. It was a bit run down, with different coloured curtains upstairs from downstairs. Sloppy, Granny Penn would have said, but it was explained by the woman who answered the door, who told Amber that Miss Veal lived in the upper part of the house before showing her up the stairs. Amber knocked on the door tentatively. She knew at once that this was Mr. Veal's daughter by her likeness to him. She was about 40 years old, plain-faced, and suspicious at seeing a young stranger at her door.
"What is that? I'm not buying anything,"
she said. Amber swallowed.
"I'm sorry. I've been sent by your mother with a message."
My mother?
Myra Veal couldn't have looked more surprised if Amber had said the Virgin Mary had sent her.
"I can't think what she wants with me, but I suppose you'd better come in."
Amber went inside. The room was stuffy and cluttered, the way an old person's room sometimes was. But Myra wasn't old, just faded and a bit dreary looking. Amber took a deep breath.
"I'm very sorry to bring you bad news, but I'm afraid your father had a heart attack this morning. He died,"
she added, hardly able to say the word. For a moment Myra said nothing, and then to Amber's horror, she started laughing.
"So, the old bugger's gone, has he? And good riddance too."
Amber was too shocked to speak at first, and then she burst out angrily.
"Didn't you hear what I said? Your father's dead, and your mother needs you."
Well, I'm not sure she can have me, although I had no quarrel with her. It was him, the mean old bugger. We haven't spoken for years, so don't expect me to mourn him now.
"But your mother's so upset."
Amber felt close to tears herself.
What's it to you, anyway?
"I work at the craft shop in Falmouth. Please say you'll go and see her. I don't know what happened between you all, and I don't want to. I just know that if I had the chance to see my mum and dad again, I'd go like a shot."
Myra stared at her for a long moment, and then nodded slowly.
"You're probably right, even if you are just a kid. You can tell my mother I'll be along this evening as soon as I can get a neighbour to take me. But there's no way I'm going to see him again."
Amber cycled back with her thoughts in a whirl. All families had secrets, and it was none of her business what had gone on in the Veal family. She would never ask Mrs. Veal, but she wondered if her gran knew. When she reached the shop again, there was a lovely smell of stew coming from the kitchen. Mrs. Veal was red-eyed but calmer now, and trying to eat a little of the stew along with Granny Penn.
"Is she coming?"
Mrs. Veal said at once. Amber told her Myra would be here later that evening, and then she was invited to join the older women in some supper. She was surprisingly hungry after all that had gone on that day, but she didn't want to be there when Myra Veal arrived, and as soon as she had eaten, she tentatively asked her gran if she could go on home.
You go, love, and I'll stay for the company until Myra arrives. It don't need all of us as a welcoming committee."
Amber was thankful to get away, thinking what a weird family they must be. There had never been any hint of it before, but then she had never known that Myra existed. There must have been some terrible row for them to have effectively shut her out of their lives. But whatever it was going to remain their secret, Granny Penn told her later, and Mrs. Veal was like the proverbial clam when it came to discussing family matters. All Granny Penn could say was that the two women had hugged and kissed and wept when they met, and that Myra had dumped a large suitcase on the floor and announced that she was staying.
"You wouldn't believe it,"
Amber complained in her letter to Dolly a month later.
"Myra's taken over in the shop now, and she treats me as little more than a hired help, when I almost had the run of the place before. Now that the funeral's over, Mrs. Veal's gone away for a few days, but she's decided to take a back seat in the shop when she comes back, and Myra's now the boss. She's left the place where she lived and moved in permanently. I can see what's coming. She's making sure the shop and the flat upstairs is left to her when Mrs. Veal pops it as well. I'm not too pleased, as you can tell, but something more exciting has happened lately. The Yanks are coming. There's a camp somewhere outside the town, and people say there will be loads and loads of them here. It's very exciting, especially for the girls. They're called GIs, but I expect you knew that.
The old chaps who remember them from the last war say they always make a fuss of the little kids, and that some of them are sure to turn up at church on Sundays, which will please a few of the local fuddy-duddies who turn up their nose at them. Apart from their big new camp, some of them are going to be billeted with local people, but we don't have any room for them, worse luck. More important than all that is that when I saw Luke's mother recently, she said he's hoping he'll get some leave by the end of the summer. I wish he'd told me, but never mind. I can't wait to see him again. So, apart from the gloom in the shop and Myra forever sniping at me, things aren't looking too bad. By the way, how's the great romance with your mum and Uncle Joe? Or aren't I supposed to ask? Your friend, Amber. A visitor arrived at the cottage one evening in late September. Granny Penn was out at one of her meetings, and although the woman looked vaguely familiar, Amber couldn't place her, and then she remembered her manners and invited her inside.
You're from the Forces Club, aren't you? That's right. I'm Jenny Tandy, the assistant supervisor. Your friend Dolly worked for us for a time, until she went back to London. How is she, by the way?
She's all right.
I hear from her quite often. Is that why you're here? To talk about Dolly? No, it's to talk about you, actually.
Me? Amber said. What do you want with me?
I'm here to offer you a job, if you're interested. You had the right attitude when you came for the evening with Dolly, and now that we're expanding our activities with the influx of GIs and so on, we've got a few vacancies. A couple of our girls have decided to join the ATS, and before we start advertising for more staff, we thought of you straight away. Are you interested?
Amber didn't know what to say for a minute. It had taken longer than she'd thought it would to get over the trauma of working at the hospital for that single day, and then the sadness of dealing with Mr. Veal's death, and now having to listen to Myra's sniping in the craft shop every day. But this didn't take longer than a minute. I say yes. I'll have to give my notice to Mrs. Veal, but now that her daughter's working for her as well, I don't think that will be any trouble. Amber was suddenly elated. She'd rather look down on Dolly at first, serving teas in a glorified canteen, but having worked there on the evening of the dance and seen what a social place it could be, she had quickly changed her mind about it. Especially now, if there were going to be so many GIs coming and going, she thought gleefully, thinking how jealous that would make Dolly when she got to hear of it. Not that she would be interested in them herself, Amber thought hastily, not when she already had a boy. Sort of.
You'll have to see what your gran thinks as well, of course, Jenny went on. But I don't think she'll object. Dolly never came to any harm, and there are plenty of us older ones to keep an eye on you, if you see what I mean. Or maybe we'll all have to keep an eye on one another when the Yanks are about, she added with a conspiratorial wink.
Amber felt a little glow of pleasure, realizing that she was being treated as an adult. She would be working in an adult world at the Forces Club, and when Jenny went on to tell her how much they were expanding the premises and planning to hold a regular monthly dance soon, all her recent restlessness seemed to fall away. She might be not quite 16 years old, and it wasn't the same as making munitions or joining the ATS, but it was useful war work all the same. By the time Jenny left, Amber was in high spirits. She couldn't wait for Granny Penn to come home so she could tell her the news. She was quite sure she wouldn't object. How could she, when she had encouraged Dolly to work there? She was impatient to tell her what had happened, but it seemed ages before she heard footsteps crunching on the gravel outside, and she flung open the front door excitedly. "Well, this is a nice way to greet anybody, nearly knocking me over before I've even got through the door," said a laughing voice.
"Luke!"
Amber almost shrieked.
"What are you doing here?"
Her head swam so much at the unexpected sight of him in his naval uniform that she could only gape for a few seconds. "I've come to see you." "So are you going to let me in, Or are we going to stand here like idiots all night? Didn't my mother tell you I was having some leave?
Yes, she did, but I didn't know when.
She felt suddenly awkward as she stood aside for him to come into the cottage. Once the door had closed behind him and they were alone, she thought how much larger he seemed than before he joined up. Larger and broader and older in his dark uniform. And she felt so much younger and sillier because of her reaction. But then she saw that he was looking at her in a different way too, and it wasn't because she was young and silly at all.
You've grown up since I've been away, he stated. You're taller and rounder and somehow different.
And it's been such a long time, hasn't it? She taunted.
But her breath was ragged in her throat, because it was a long time. Even one day would have seemed a long time, and right now it seemed like an eternity since she had seen him and talked to him and been with him.
Give us a kiss, then, Luke said.
She giggled nervously. But before she could make some daft and typically Amber comment, Luke had pulled her into his arms, and his mouth was hard and demanding on hers. Again, this was a proper kiss, a grown-up kiss, and her arms were wrapped tightly around him, and she could feel herself pressing into every part of him as he was into her. She could feel the texture of his skin against her face, so different from her own soft skin. She could breathe his scent, warm and deeply masculine, and if she'd ever thought herself in love before, it was nothing compared with this overwhelming feeling.
Well, Luke said in a husky voice when they finally broke away, you've definitely grown up. It's probably just as well I came back to stake my claim before these Yanks get a good look at you.
You've got a nerve,
she said, trying to be flippant and to slow down the hammering of her heart.
Stake your claim, indeed. What do you think I am? Some kind of gold mine?
Nope. Just my crazy Amber. You are my Amber, aren't you?
If you want me, she said, unknowingly provocative. He broke away properly as they heard sounds outside the cottage.
You'll never know how much,
he muttered, just before the door opened and Granny Penn came inside and greeted Luke in surprise. But then she took a good look at the two of them, both with flushed cheeks and breathing faster than usual, and she dumped her hat and bag on the sofa, effectively putting a small barrier between any two people who wanted to share it.
Time for a cold drink, I think. You two look as if you could do with it, and I certainly could. Have you been here long, Luke?
Hardly any time at all, he said.
He looked at Amber and saw the small smile curving around her mouth, the soft, generous mouth that he had so recently kissed. Instinctively, he knew their thoughts were the same at that moment. He had been here hardly any time at all in terms of minutes and seconds, but in their hearts and minds they had covered a great distance. The moment was so intense that Amber had to turn away before she gave away too much of her feelings in her eyes. Side 8.
Gran? I've got some news for you, she called out to Granny Penn in the kitchen. I had another visitor just before Luke arrived, and I've been offered a job at the Forces Club. They're expanding the place now that the Yanks are here, and are going to have a regular monthly dance there too.
You didn't tell me anything about that, Luke said.
I've hardly had a chance, have I?
Granny Penn came back into the room and put 3 glasses of lemonade on the table. There was a distinct change of atmosphere between the other two now, and she hid a small smile, remembering how volatile young love could be, if young love was what she was witnessing now. She sat down firmly on one end of the sofa and took a long, cool drink before she replied to Amber.
So, what makes you think this new job will suit you? I thought you were settled at the crafts shop, and not so long ago you thought you'd like to work at the hospital. You can't spend your life chopping and changing, my dear.
Amber stared at her. Her new-found happiness, partly from the job offer, but mostly because of Luke, began to ebb away.
Why are you looking so cross? She burst out. You know how much I hate working with Myra, and I thought you understood my feelings about the hospital. I haven't done anything wrong, as far as I know, so what else has upset you?
Luke drained his glass of lemonade in one swallow, sensing a battle of wills to come.
I think I'd better go and leave you two to sort out your problems. If you fancy it, we can go to the pictures tomorrow night, Amber. I'm only home for 3 days, so I'll look in at the shop tomorrow to fix it up.
All right, she said, wishing she dared say goodbye with a kiss, and knowing she had better not. In any case, the decision was taken away from her when he turned abruptly and left the cottage. Amber railed at her gran, her eyes bright with anger.
Why did you have to go and say all that? Just as me and Luke were getting along fine, you made me sound like an idiot who couldn't make up her mind about anything. He's taking you to the pictures tomorrow night, isn't he? I'd say you were still getting along fine. Perhaps a bit too fine.
What's that supposed to mean? Amber said, aware that her heart was thudding for a different reason now.
My love, it's easy to see when a pretty girl's just been kissed by a lusty young man, and I'm not so old that I don't remember how easily a young maid can have her head turned either. Is that what you think of me, then? That I'm just a silly young maid who's had her head turned because a boy's kissed her? Me and Luke have known one another all our lives, Gran, and he's always been my friend.
Granny Penn's eyebrows arched.
Oh, really? It doesn't seem so long ago that you frequently came storming in here, telling me you hated all boys, and Luke Gillam in particular. I seem to recall that he could always rub you up the wrong way, and I'm sure you were nothing more than a thorn in his flesh at times too. I was just a kid then. You're still a baby in my eyes, my love.
Amber folded her arms tightly around herself, as if only by doing so could she stop herself exploding with rage. But this wasn't the time. This was a time for keeping as calm as possible and not resorting to childish tantrums.
But I'm not a baby, am I, Gran? I'll be 16 in a few months' time, and that's quite old enough to have deep feelings about somebody or anybody. And do you have deep feelings about a particular somebody already?
Amber felt her face grow hot.
I think you know I do.
She felt suddenly deflated as she sat down on the sofa, pushing her Gran's hat and bag aside.
Gran, you don't really believe that going on 16 is too young to have proper grown-up feelings for somebody, do you?
To her surprise, Granny Penn leaned forward and kissed her cheek.
Of course I don't. But nor do I think they're going to be the last feelings you'll ever have either. They might, but it's unlikely. Call it first love or puppy love or any other fancy name you like. The fact is, it doesn't usually last, my dear, so it's unwise to get too intense about it.
So, how do you help it? Amber asked.
If you're going to say that me and Luke shouldn't see too much of each other, well, the war's going to see to that. We've always seen a lot of each other, so I don't see why that should change now. Anyway, I don't want to talk about it anymore. So what about this job at the Forces Club? You still haven't told me what you think about it.
Would it make any difference if I did? Granny Penn said dryly. You've got a strong will and a mind of your own, Amber, and if it's what you want to do, I think you'll do it.
But I want to know what you think,
Amber said crossly. I think you'll do whatever you want to do, but if it means so much to you, then you have my blessing. Perhaps mixing with other people in a social atmosphere instead of being in a small shop all day long will be a good thing anyway. It might even take her mind off Luke Gillam too, Granny Penn thought. Not that she had any objections to the boy. She liked him a good deal, but in those few moments when she had come home, she had seen him as a man and not a boy, and Amber wasn't ready for an adult relationship yet, whatever she might think. Amber could read her Gran's mind very well. In local circles, Granny Penn might be considered a wise woman with a sixth sense and a teller of fortunes, but for once she was wrong, Amber thought passionately. That evening, Granny Penn wasn't the only one who had seen Luke as a man and not a boy, and the feelings racing around Amber's body as she got ready for bed that evening were far from the childish ones she used to have when they argued and fought and teased one another. She was thinking of him now as her young man, her lover. The seductively beautiful word crept into her mind and made her catch her breath. For once, she didn't feel inclined to grab her pen and paper and write down details of the whole evening to Dolly. Some things were too private to share at once, if at all. Maybe she would tell her in time. Well, all right, of course she would tell her, she amended. She was in love, and it was an always and forever kind of love, despite what Granny Penn might think it, and she wouldn't be able to keep such a momentous event to herself forever. But tonight, instead of writing to Dolly, there would be a single dignified entry in her diary, and no other words were necessary. Luke's home. Tonight he kissed me again. Just reading the words in black and white gave her a thrill, and she touched her fingers to her mouth, remembering the sensation when Luke had kissed it, remembering how every part of his body had pressed into hers, and being very aware that his feelings for her were far from childish ones too. She gave a shiver as she snuggled into bed, because although the feelings were so new and exciting, she wasn't exactly sure what to do with them, or what he might expect of her now. She found out that things were not as rose-coloured as she might have imagined when he strode into the craft shop the following morning. By then, she had had what her Gran would have called words with Myra Veal, who had been scathing over her decision to work at the Forces Club, her normally pasty face turning an ugly puce colour as Amber snapped at her. "You want to mind what you say, miss?" Myra snapped back. "You don't know what sort of blokes you'll come into contact with at that place, though maybe that's what you're hoping for. Young girls like you get their heads turned far too easily these days, what with all the riff-raff coming off the ships, and now these Yanks invading us with their easy talk and easier money." "Invading us? Are you stupid? They're not the enemy. And just because you were never able to attract a man, don't put us all in the same boat." Amber hadn't meant to be so personal, but the words were out before she could stop them. "That's enough of your insolence. If you can't keep a civil tongue in your head, you can leave right now. There's no need to work out your notice." Amber gasped. "You can't tell me to leave. You're not my employer." "I can do what I like on my mother's behalf, and I don't want her worried by any of your nonsense. I'll sort out what's owing to you, and you can call in another time to collect it. It doesn't take two of us here to run this little place."
"Well, that sounds to me as if you've just been waiting for an excuse to sack me. But I was going anyway, and the sooner the better."
That was when the shop door opened and Luke appeared. He took one look at the two angry faces inside and shrugged.
"Still antagonizing people, I see," he said to Amber. "If you can be spared for 10 minutes, come for a walk with me to cool off."
"I can be spared for more than 10 minutes,
Amber said, furious at his remark when he had no idea what had been going on.
I'm leaving here for good, and I might think about taking a walk with you."
She bit her lip, angry that it was trembling now. After last night, the last thing she wanted to do was to seem so infantile in front of Luke, or to be bickering with him. It wasn't his row, but somehow she had made it so. She couldn't think why he looked so mad, but he certainly did. In a moment, it seemed, they were back to their squabbling school days, when last night she had felt so grown up and sophisticated, and really believed they were on the brink of courting properly.
"What's up?"
she said, as she tried to keep up with his long legs. She was tall, but he was taller, and she was exhausted by the time they finally sat down on a wooden seat along the quay. It was hardly the weather for it. It was a dank morning, which added to the downbeat mood.
"Are you sure you want to take this job at the Forces Club?"
"Why shouldn't I? You're not jealous, are you? You don't think I'm going to get carried away by the first handsome Yank I see, do you?
That's more up Dolly's street, not mine."
"Maybe. But they'd be far more attracted to you."
"You are jealous."
Amber was unsure whether to be flattered or astonished.
"Don't be ridiculous. I'm just concerned about you, that's all. You're not exactly the most worldly person, are you?"
"I'm not an idiot either. Why would I be interested in anybody else when I have you?" She felt her heart begin to thud, and she wished she hadn't blurted out such a stupid thing. She was as good as telling him she wanted to be his girl, and he hadn't actually asked her yet, not in so many words anyway. It was all in her head. If he wasn't even the tiniest bit jealous that she'd be in contact with the glamorous GIs, it seemed to say it all.
"Amber, you're only 15.
I'll be 16 in a few months' time."
God knows where I'll be by then. Probably on some god-forsaken ocean nobody's ever heard of. If this war goes on much longer, there's always a chance I may not even come back at all."
She was suddenly frightened.
"You shouldn't say such things. It's bad luck. It's all right for me to be nervous, but now that you've said it, you've got to take it back at once. Say you know you're coming back. Say it out loud. I mean it, Luke. If you care for me at all, don't frighten me."
He laughed. "My God, you're definitely Granny Penn's granddaughter, aren't you, with your weird omens and superstitions? All right, if it means so much to you, then of course I'm coming back. I've got my piece of amber to keep me safe, you cuckoo. And I seem to remember when we were kids, I said I was going to marry you to keep you under control. I'll have to come back for that, won't I?" Amber caught her breath. From the sparkle in his eyes, she knew he was only teasing, but he'd said the words, and she stored them away in her heart. She knew it would be a mistake to make some soppy comment and spoil the moment. Instead, she spoke airily, as if a long-ago childish remark meant nothing to her, when in reality it meant everything.
"That's all right then. So, are we still going to the pictures tonight or not?"
"Of course we are. I'll meet you outside. Now I'm off to see some old mates." He squeezed her hand and strode off along the quay. Watching him walk away from her, she knew he was going to show off in his uniform more like. He wasn't totally hers. She felt at a complete loss for a few moments. She had just given up her job at the craft shop, and she wasn't due to start at the Forces Club for another week. The day was grey and miserable, and within minutes it had begun to drizzle with a fine rain. She shivered as she looked out to where the sea almost met the sky in greyness. Falmouth Bay was practically clogged with ships of every description now, and the quays constantly teemed with men in uniform. Nothing emphasised these dangerous times more. The days when they would come down here as children and watch the ferries come and go, and the little sailing boats putting to sea at the weekends in a glorious cluster of coloured sails, were long gone. People still did those things. They still fell in love, got married, and had babies. But nothing was so relaxed anymore, and there was anxiety in everything nowadays. It was easy not to think about such things when you were little, but impossible to ignore them now. Amber found herself gazing upwards into a sombre, wintry sky where there was no sign of enemy planes right now, but where the hovering barrage balloons gave a constant reminder of their threat. It had been relatively quiet of late, but that only added to the tension of wondering when the next air raid would come, and what the result of it would be.
"Hey there! You better mind where you're going, little lady. You nearly walked right into us."
Amber felt her heart jolt. She had been walking aimlessly ever since Luke had left her. She was quite aware of the water's edge, and she'd been along here enough times to walk blindfold without any mishap. It was almost second nature to dodge anyone coming her way, but she had been so busy looking upward that she hadn't noticed the 3 laughing young men in smart uniforms until one of them caught hold of her by the shoulders to stop her blundering right into him. She registered the unfamiliar accent seconds after she recognised the fact that these weren't British soldiers, nor sailors off the ships. They were Americans, Yanks, GIs. And since she had not met any of them yet, she was too flustered to say anything until the one who had spoken let her go and looked anxious.
"Say, miss, I didn't hurt you when I grabbed hold of you, did I? I was afraid you were daydreaming there and you might have gone into the drink."
She replied quickly then, lest they should think her a country bumpkin.
"No, you didn't hurt me. It was my fault for not looking where I was going. I'm perfectly all right, thank you."
"That's okay then. It wouldn't do to get on the wrong side of the locals before we've hardly arrived in town, would it, guys? I'm Will, by the way, and these 2 are Gary and Chuck."
"Oh, I'm Amber,"
she said unthinkingly, though what her gran would have said about her being so free and easy with 3 strangers she couldn't think.
"Well then, hope to see you around, Amber, since we'll be in the neighbourhood for a spell,"
Will said breezily, and then they seemed to separate and move away from her in one swift movement. She was still taking all this in as the rain began to fall more persistently, and she bolted back to the shop to fetch her bicycle and pelted on home. Once indoors, she yelled out loudly to her gran that she'd left the craft shop and miserable Myra for good, and that she had just met some Yanks, and that they didn't seem foreign after all.
"They're just like us, really," she finished. "They talk funny, of course, but I dare say we talk funny to them as well."
"What did you expect? Creatures from Mars?"
Granny Penn said. Amber giggled, suddenly realising that the encounter had been quite exciting, even if she'd been too startled to notice it at the time. It was certainly something to tell Dolly next time she wrote, and it was funny how the Yanks, well, Will, had sort of teased her about daydreaming when she had always used that word to describe Dolly. It must mean something, but right now she couldn't think what. Luke was waiting outside the cinema when she arrived that evening. The rain had stopped, and it was a cool evening, with pale glimpses of moonlight now and then. Just the sort of night for enemy planes to take advantage of the shifting clouds, Amber thought, and immediately wished it had never come into her head.
"Cheer up," Luke said. "I thought you'd be in a good mood tonight, having chucked in one job and got another one without even trying."
"I am in a good mood. I'm just hoping we don't have an air raid tonight, that's all."
"They'll probably be too busy bombing some other poor devils to bother with us down here in the sticks. Forget them and enjoy the picture."
She probably did, but afterwards she could hardly remember what it was about. She was all too conscious that they were sitting in the back row, and that after a little while Luke's arms slid around her shoulders and she snuggled into him. Even when the usherette's torch shone briefly on them as she showed other people to their seats, he didn't take his arm away, and it made her feel special and elated. They came out of the cinema to calmer skies, and he tucked her arm in his as he walked her home, and she had never felt so happy. They were definitely walking out together now, she thought. They paused at the gate of the cottage, and he put his arms around her as she waited eagerly for his kiss. She had wondered if she should ask him inside for a drink or something, but thought better of it. It would be a bit of an anticlimax to the evening to have Granny Penn sitting there playing gooseberry. "There's something I want to tell you, Amber." She blinked because he sounded so serious, without a hint of romance in his voice. "Something good, I hope?" But it wouldn't be. She knew it wouldn't be. How many senses did it take to know you were about to hear something you didn't want to hear? "Something sensible," he said. She groaned inwardly, but tried to be flippant. "I hate it when somebody says that. It always means they're going to tell me something I don't want to hear. So if it's all the same to you, Luke, I'd rather you didn't say it." "I have to say it, sweetheart." Amber caught her breath. It must be serious if he was actually calling her sweetheart instead of cuckoo or idiot or crackpot, and she knew instinctively that it was going to break her heart. He raised her hand to his lips in a sweet old-fashioned gesture, but she snatched her hand away, knowing she had to say it first before he did. "You don't want me to think of you in a special way, because you don't feel the same way about me, do you? All that silly talk of marrying me someday was just kids' talk, wasn't it?" "Of course it was kids' talk. We were only kids when we said it. It doesn't mean I don't think a lot of you, Amber, and I always will. But I think it's wrong for us to get too serious about one another right now. The timing's all wrong." Well, how idiotic was that? As if timing made any difference to when people fell in love. But she knew he was floundering. He wasn't the articulate Luke he had always been. He was trying not to hurt her, but he could hardly hurt her more. Every bit of her was hurting, and if this was what her gran had meant by puppy love that didn't last, then she wanted no more of it. She lashed out at him. "Well, I'm sorry if rotten old Hitler had to start a war and make the timing all wrong for you. Perhaps we should have told him to hang on for a few years until you didn't think of me as a kid anymore." He caught hold of her hands and held them tight. "I don't think of you as a kid anymore. That's just the trouble." Her heart pounded. "What's that supposed to mean? Why should that be the trouble? I don't understand you. Don't you want me to grow up? I'm not going to be Pollyanna forever." "You never were." She felt like stamping her feet, but if she did, it would only underline the frustration she was feeling now. The childish frustration. She folded her arms tightly the way she often did when she was trying to hold in her emotions. They were still standing close, but she had never felt more remote from him. The night had darkened and grown colder, matching her mood, and she couldn't see the expression in his eyes anymore. "Why don't you just come out with what you're trying to say, Luke?" "Perhaps I should, even if you're not going to like it. It's about what I said yesterday, that I might not come back. It's no use being an ostrich about this and burying your head in the sand. And what I said about marrying you, well, that's just about as unrealistic, isn't it?" "Is it?" Amber said in a strangled voice. Her head was spinning now. Did he mean he didn't love her? That he had never loved her? Luke swore beneath his breath and pulled her into his arms. She was still holding herself tightly, and it was an awkward and uncomfortable embrace. There was no romance in his voice when he spoke. Instead, it was harsh, almost angry. "Amber, you can't face these facts, then you're certainly not ready to sit at home brooding and waiting for something that might never happen. There's a war on, in case you hadn't noticed it.
People are being killed, or at the very least returning home wounded, some with terrible injuries that will never heal. Remember how we all felt over Mr. Thomas's son? And none of us even knew him.
Not everybody gets wounded or killed,
She almost wept.
How can you be so stupid as to lump everybody together like that?
But why should I be one of the lucky ones? Just because I got your piece of amber to protect me, that doesn't take account of all the Jerry U-boats out there waiting to destroy our ships. I'm sure there are sailors on those bloody evil subs who have got good luck charms from their girlfriends as well. Why shouldn't they be the ones to survive?
You're scaring me now,
Amber said shrilly.
Have you got a death wish or something?
Of course not. I want to come home safely after the end of the war and lead a normal life again. Don't you think I'd far rather be building boats than blowing them up? But until that day comes, I refuse to have any obligations that I may never be able to fulfill.
You don't want me to be your girl then?
Amber said, her voice brittle. You'll always be my girl. And if we were both 5 years older, I'd think differently about things. But you're only 15, Amber. You're not even legally old enough to get married, and you must promise me that you won't waste your life waiting for me to come home. Promise me now. How could she possibly promise such a thing when her heart was breaking? He was being so sensible, so much more grown up than she was. The years between them suddenly seemed more like eons, and she was raging inside at the unfairness of it all. But he was waiting for an answer, and she knew she had to give it. You didn't send a warrior away to war without giving him everything he wanted, even if it seemed that he didn't want her.
All right,
she said finally, her voice choking.
If it's what you want, I can hardly object, can I? Don't imagine that I won't think of you and pray for you and all that stuff, though, because I will, every day. I suppose I'm still allowed to write to you now and then, or is that off limits as well?
Of course. We're old friends, Amber. Real friends don't ever lose touch. The words seemed to damn their relationship forever, but somehow he had released her tightly folded arms, and she found herself clinging to him. He kissed her just once, a sweetly chaste kiss, the kiss of a friend. And then she turned swiftly and ran inside the cottage, unable to bear it a minute longer. Once inside, she leaned against the door she had slammed, her eyes brimming with tears, and with the sixth sense she was blessed with, Granny Pen held out her arms, and Amber rushed into them, sobbing her heart out. Finding it impossible to go straight home, Luke headed for Pendennis Hill, where he and Amber and all their friends had spent so many madcap hours over the years. It was a long walk, and would be an even longer walk back home, but he was in such a foul mood he hardly noticed it. He felt like yelling out loud with the worst cuss words he could think of, because he knew bloody well how much he had hurt her. He had to get away from people, to come up here to the place they had always loved best, to try and cool off before he went home. It had been the hardest thing in his life to do what he had just done, seeing the spirit go out of Amber's beautiful eyes, and knowing he was ruining her lovely romantic dreams. His too, he thought harshly, because she would never know how much he had fought against the urge to crush her to him and make love to her, to put the final seal on a special relationship that had begun so many years ago, and to make her irrevocably his. He had a lusty nature, and sometimes it was hard to curb it. But already, in the relatively short time he had been at sea, he had seen and heard about too many sorrows in marriages that had been too hasty. He had read the newspapers, giving their guarded numbers of the casualties the Allies were suffering.
He had read his mother's letters, in which she had felt obliged to tell him of people he had known, boys he had been at school with, coming home maimed or not coming home at all. He wasn't a fool, and he knew this didn't necessarily mean such a fate was in store for him, but nor did he think he was especially charmed, despite the smooth, warm feel of the piece of amber he was never without. It all came down to the same thing. Amber was too young to be tied to any romantic dreams of him. She had to be free to make other friendships, and so did he. That didn't mean he intended being a skirt chaser, like some of the blokes on his ship. His feelings for Amber were as deep as he was sure hers were for him. But it was too soon. If the war hadn't happened, but it had, and for them the timing was all wrong, and there was nothing anybody could bloody well do to change that. When he reached and rounded the top of the hill, he stared down savagely into the inky black waters below him. The sandy beaches to his right, that had once been so welcoming in the soft summer months, now looked menacing with their barbed wire entanglements. The hill sloped more gently at this point, and not too far below were the caves where their old school gang had so often played and sheltered from sudden storms. In some ways it seemed like yesterday, but they had all moved on, and one or two of the older boys they knew would never be coming home again. Luke had steeled himself into making sure that no matter how long this war lasted, Amber wasn't going to spend her time worrying and grieving for him. But because he was being completely honest with himself, he knew that part of him was also relishing this chance to go away and be a hero. If it took a war to bring this chance that came once in a lifetime, then so be it. All his life he had loved boats and the sea, like his father before him. It was in his blood, and if the worst ever happened, he couldn't bear the thought of Amber mourning him. There were widows in the town from the last war, sad, lonely women, no older than his own mother, and he would never put someone he loved through that loneliness. He may be only 18 years old, but he thought far too much of Amber for that. He respected her too, and one day, when all this was over, they could think about the future properly. She would eventually realize that this was no more than a temporary pause, and in Luke's mind it was inconceivable that they wouldn't be together one day. Amber didn't have to tell her Gran what had happened. The misery was all in her eyes. She was given a hot, sweet drink, as if she was in shock, which she supposed she was, and then she went to bed, nursing her badly bruised feelings. But she had to tell someone, and the more she wrote, the more defensive she became. "I wasn't going to tell you any of this," she wrote finally to Dolly, when she had poured it all out, her pencil stabbing at the page. "But me and Luke are finished for good now. He doesn't want me waiting for him, so I won't. I shall flirt with the Yanks at the Forces Club instead. That'll show him whether I'm too young or not." She read the words again. She had written them out of bravado, but the more she thought about it, the more she thought, why not? There wouldn't be anything serious about it, and she certainly wouldn't risk getting a bad reputation. She could just imagine what Granny Penn would have to say about that. But a bit of teasing with some of those boys who were far from home was what the older girls at the Forces Club did all the time, and she'd never heard of any of them coming to any harm. It was practically a duty to keep their serving boys happy. Anyway, thought Amber savagely, she'd bet her boots that if Dolly was here now, she'd be doing it, and more. She had to keep feeling defensive and aggressive too, or else she knew she'd feel more like falling apart. At church one Sunday morning, Amber heard from Luke's mother that he wouldn't be home for Christmas. He'd said he couldn't give her his exact location, just that it was a long way from home. It was a shame, Mrs. Gillam said gamely, but there was a war on, and they all had to make the best of it. Amber gritted her teeth and tried to keep smiling as she heard those words yet again. The fact that there was a war on seemed to be the excuse for anything these days, for food and petrol rationing, and now they had fewer clothing coupons too. If it went on much longer, everyone would be starving and going around in rags, Amber thought dramatically. Dolly's reply regarding Luke had been predictably decisive.
Good for you, gal. You shouldn't waste your time on Lukey boy when there are all those good-looking Yanks around. You make the most of it while you can. I've got my eye on one of them as well. His name's John Joe McAllister III. A scream, ain't it? He said his grandfather came from Scotland, but he's from some place in Ohio. I'm not sure where that is, but I don't think it's anywhere near Hollywood. Tell me everything about the ones you meet in the Forces Club.
It was all just typical of Dolly, Amber thought. She'd be off with the old and on with the new without a second thought, although Dolly had never been serious about a boy yet. Not like Amber had been, and look where that had got her.
You're not old enough to tie yourself down,
Granny Penn had told her that night when Luke had finished with her.
I admire Luke for being so sensible about it. There's time enough for you to think about courting when you're older. Young people often have several romances before they think of settling down.
I'm not thinking about settling down, Amber had raged. I just want to be special to him, that's all. And I thought I was.
Have you really thought about what being in the forces means, Amber? I'm not talking about the glamour of the uniforms, but of being away for months, sometimes years on end.
They get leave, don't they?
Granny Penn smiled. Yes, but it's not like being in an ordinary job.
You remember Mrs. Bibby at my Save for Victory Club, don't you?
Her son is in the Navy, and he's been away for 8 months now. Sailors could be away for a year or more, depending on where their ship is sent. It's not like catching a bus home from Redruth for the weekend.
8 months,
Amber echoed, hearing nothing else. Granny Penn pressed on.
And one of Mrs. Bibby's nephews is a prisoner of war, so only the good Lord knows when he'll be coming home again. He's got a young wife and baby too. Women have to be strong to cope with such partings, Amber. That's why I think Luke did the right thing in cooling things down between you. It doesn't mean he thinks any the less of you, my dear.
If she was trying to scare Amber, she was certainly succeeding. She heard nothing from Luke for weeks, until the card for her 16th birthday with Luke's handwriting on it. Amber looked at it for a long moment, then deliberately screwed it up and threw it in the bin, and then retrieved it moments later and put it at the bottom of a drawer.